SJC-11311, Commonwealth versus Miguel Roman.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, Your Honors. I'm Attorney Donald Harwood. I'm here on behalf of the defendant appellant Miguel Roman. And one of the main arguments on appeal that I want to discuss at some length today is an evidentiary sufficiency argument. And in this case, I would suggest to the court this is an unusual set of facts with questions that are basically unanswerable based upon the questionable testimony of two cooperating witnesses. One was Luis Soto, who had murder charges no prost. The other was Felipe Gonzalez, who had murder charges no prost. Angel Gonzalez, a third person, was not at the time available to testify because there was a murder charge still pending against him. And that left...
Murder charge in this case or a different one?
In this case, too. And that leaves the defendant, Miguel Roman, who was severed from these other three defendants and then tried. And the Commonwealth proceeded only on a principal theory, and the judge instructed on a principal theory that the Commonwealth had made such election and that they had to prove that Miguel Roman himself, these are the judge's words in the instruction, had shot and killed the victim, Santiago. And the case is basically a case put together, and the Commonwealth refers to these and submits them in the appendix, with videotapes and the testimony of these two cooperating witnesses. But the point I want to make from the evidence is this. Luis Soto is, according to the Commonwealth's evidence, the driver of this vehicle, a Nissan Altima. To his right, according to him, in the front passenger seat, is Angel Rodriguez. A week before this incident, there had been an altercation between Angel Rodriguez in which the Rodriguezes had stolen $800 worth of jewelry because they were owed that much from the victim.
So who had a confrontation with the victim?
A week before, the Gonzalezes, Angel Gonzalez, had taken jewelry from the victim because of an $800 drug debt. And the evidence came in at the trial that the victim called Angel Rodriguez and said, I'm going to effing kill you, words to that effect. That's the setup. There's no motive evidence in this case at all that Roman had anything to do with the victim prior to this incident or even knew him. But there is this 1 week in advance, a theft, or rather a failure to pay back $800, a theft of jewelry, and then a threat by the victim to Angel Rodriguez that he was going to kill him. So in this car you have Luis Soto in the driver's seat, Angel Rodriguez in the passenger seat. According to Soto and Felipe Gonzalez, who enter into cooperation agreements, you have Miguel Roman behind the driver, the victim is in the center, and Felipe is on the right, the brother of Angel Rodriguez. The testimony of both Luis Soto and Felipe Gonzalez was that they picked up Santiago, who had had his car stolen in a carjacking an hour and a half before, and that shortly before the shooting, they picked up Miguel Roman, who got in the car to the left of the victim. Then, according to Soto and Felipe Gonzalez, They were told to take a right on Essex Street, and shortly after they take a right on Essex Street, both these witnesses testify they hear one shot. They don't testify they hear bang, bang. They don't testify they hear more than one shot.
Is that the main reason? I mean, the Commonwealth obviously has a theory that your client shot the victim on the left, and then everybody else had left the car and came around and shot him again on the right, correct?
Yes.
So
And
is
they
your
say
main
in their
objection
brief-
to that about the two, that Philippe and Louis did not hear two shots?
They say, without any support whatsoever, the defendant's argument rests on the unsupported premises that the fatal shot was fired into the left, into the right temple. They say that my basis is unsupported, and they say it must be that both Philippe and Luis Soto, and one of these guys is a military man, it must be that both of them were mistaken when they said they heard just one shot.
Wasn't there a ballistics expert who testified that two shots fired almost simultaneously could sound like one?
No. There was no testimony. There was testimony from Joanne Richmond, who said, and she was the medical examiner, that there were two shots to the back left head, and she said because of the proximity of one on top of the other, they must have been fired in rapid succession.
Right, and
But
there was no ballistics expert testimony?
There was a ballistics expert who testified only that this was a .22 caliber Brico Jennings semi-automatic pistol. And what he testified to is this is not a fully automatic pistol where you pull the trigger and it goes bang, 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 bang. This is a semi-automatic pistol, and there was testimony that means you have to pull the trigger once, twice for each shot. He testifies to that, and that's what a semi-automatic pistol is.
I
So-
thought that the Commonwealth had in its brief, maybe I'm mistaken, that someone testified that two shots fired almost simultaneously could sound like one.
No, and look at their brief, because I looked at it carefully. They make this assertion that these two witnesses must have been mistaken when they each said that they only heard one shot, and all they cite to is basically testimony from one of the men, Luis Soto, that it was a really loud bang.
But I'm sorry, but, okay, why does that mean that there isn't sufficient evidence? I mean, what is it that isn't sufficient?
Because if neither of these, if the jury only had evidence from each of the principal witnesses that they heard one shot, and only one shot in the car, that's what each of them testified to.
But there's two bullets.
Yes, but those two bullets had to have been fired. There's no evidence from the two principal witnesses that that wound was inflicted in the car.
Well, why couldn't the jury conclude they were mistaken, that there were actually two shots fired?
Because there was no evidence upon which to base, and I quote in my reply brief, how could they conclude that either of these witnesses was mistaken? Question to Philippe, how many shots did you hear? Answer, at that moment when I was inside the car, I heard one shot.
Well, they could conclude that they were mistaken because there was evidence that there were two shots, and
Question.
they only heard one.
Question, when you say that you heard a shot, you didn't hear two shots, three shots, you heard a shot. Isn't that correct? Answer, a shot. Go on to the other witness, Luis Soto. Question, and how many detonations or sounds did you hear? Answer, one. When you look at Soto's statement to the police, he says basically he heard a loud bang in the back of the car.
This happens all the time. You know, witnesses will get up and say, I heard one shot, another one will say, I heard three, another one say, I heard five, and it turns out there were four.
But here you have the Commonwealth witnesses unequivocally testifying to one shot. You have Philippe Gonzalez, a cooperating witness, to the right of him, who was definitely in the position to shoot the fatal right temple shot.
Well, wasn't there, certainly the Commonwealth's brief indicates that the medical examiner, somebody testified that both the left and the right were fatal shots.
Yes, but remember,
But you said
the two shots to
fatal
the
shot.
left,
Yeah,
she said, had to have been fired in rapid succession.
Yeah.
She said one of these on the right was definitely fatal.
so you're
And-
suggesting that he
and
got shot?
one of the two on the left was fatal, is what she said.
Yeah.
My point is, she said that the one on the left had to have been fired in rapid succession because one was on top of the other. And if that had happened in the car, there would have been two shots in the car. Instead, what Soto says is, he was driving along, he heard one shot, and he looked around and he saw the victim fall forward into the center of the car. And then they point to the testimony of a civilian witness, Saint Amman. She is at 78 Newton Street, which is around the corner from where this car stopped, and apparently these shots took place. Now, each of these cooperating witnesses testified that the only person in that car was Miguel Roman, and that he single-handedly then must have driven around to Newton Street, dumped the body on his own, got back in the car, circled the block to Sam's, and left it with them, the three of them. And you saw testimony, you saw evidence on the videotape. They're the ones who go back to the scene and jump out and retrieve Philippe's cell phone, which he drops.
But the videotapes are consistent with just the three of them being there, right?
You see three people
At the right
at the
time.
store at different times. And remember, the syncing of the store tape is off by 2 minutes. But the point that the Commonwealth skips over in its brief is this. Saint Amman says very clearly, and I quote it because it goes on in her testimony, that when that car stopped, she heard it stop in front of her house. She looked out. She saw one man in a hooded sweatshirt get out and pull something out of the car and dump it. She couldn't see what it was. And then she said she saw him circle a back round and get into the driver's side back seat, not the front seat. So in other words, she's testifying.
Does she say it was the back seat?
She says, this is by the prosecutor, not defense counsel. While you were peeking out the window, did you actually see a person get into that car again? Answer, yes, I did. And where did that person get into that car? Answer, in the back seat on the driver's side. So that person came around the back of the car and then went into the back seat of the side, and that is now closest to you? Yes. And then a further question. So that person went from the rear passenger side around the car and got into the rear driver's side, and then the car took off? Yes. Now, did you hear anything when that car took off at that point? Answer, actually, I just heard them taking off, speeding, shut the door, and took off. So here's another question. Who is the second man? And when you look at this videotape, and you can look at it again and again, you can never make out who's who, I would suggest to you, because it's so grainy. But one thing really struck me when I looked at it for about the 11th time. When you see the car take off from Essex Street, it doesn't like rush off, it begins to take off. You see the back passenger door is open. Now they say that my client got out, walked around, looked in, and then after 10 seconds walked back, got in, and drove off. What the video shows is the car door, a four-door Nissan Altima, is still open. He doesn't shut it, whoever it is, close it, and then walk around and drive. He gets in the car, it begins to drive off slowly, and then mysteriously, the door closes. And it's something that wasn't really raised at the trial, but it's raised by the evidence. How did that door close? If the car didn't speed off, and if somebody couldn't possibly reach from the driver's side to close it, it raises another question in that sense. And again, why do I raise it? Because the witness right around the corner said there was somebody driving and there was somebody in the back seat. And somebody in the back seat pulled the body out, and then they took off and somebody else was driving. They left. And the people she describes, they say, well, she said it looked most like Miguel Roman. The police said it's a non-identification. He wasn't wearing a hoodie like she saw. And miraculously, the police didn't put Philippe, who was wearing a hoodie, in the identification they showed her. They didn't put Soto, who was wearing a hoodie, in the identification that they showed. So the point I'm trying to make is, if there was one shot that they heard in the car, according to them, and this is what they told police immediately after, and they didn't hear two shots, then the fatal gunshot must have been to the right temple. The only person in a position to have done that was Felipe Gonzalez. He immediately bolts from the car.
Why would they testify to that, though?
What's that?
Why would they testify to that if that's consistent with one of them doing it?
Because when you're not telling the truth and you've committed yourself to a story with the police, sometimes the story falls apart. It's like, why is it that there are at least two people around the corner disposing of a body?
How long after the killing were they interviewed? The two Gonzalez
It was
brothers?
like the next day. If I remember, it's like almost immediate. All three of them, it's like the next day. And
And they're obviously not interviewed together, right?
correct.
And I take it their interviews were reduced to writing or videotaped?
I don't remember if they're videotaped, but they're described the statements are described at length.
And are they asked in those statements, well, if you say that there was only one shot, how do you account for the fact that there were?
Exactly, and that
What do
is
they say?
asked, and Philippe has no explanation for it.
But they both.
And they consistently say one shot. And Philippe is in the National Guard and says, I know what a shot sounds like. Everybody, so how could it be that one of their cooperating witnesses is mistaken on this? Their other cooperating witness is mistaken on this. There's no evidence upon which that the Commonwealth cites that a jury could conclude they are mistaken. They seem unequivocal in this, and that's what they told the police. So at some point, when you have a case with such a, it's like Zanetti, where this.
Not like Zanetti, though, right? There was one shot in Zanetti, right?
In Zanetti, you have a case set aside because it would have had to have been shot from the left.
But it was one shot,
Right.
not three.
But here, it's the same thing in the sense that their evidence is there's one shot in the car, not two.
Well,
And
yes,
to
but
just say, oh, they must have both been mistaken, they were mistaken with the police, they were mistaken in front of the jury, there's no evidence upon which a jury could conclude otherwise that there was one shot.
Why couldn't the jury believe everything else they said, but not their recollection about how many shots there were?
But they're interviewed the day after. How could it be a bad recollection? This is what they tell police within 24 hours.
Well, as
they're
Justice
mistaken.
Spina said, they're mistaken, but they credit everything else that makes the story hold together.
As I say, I don't see any basis in the evidence from which a jury could conclude here that there were two shots in that car, because the only witnesses who testified who were in the car said there was only one shot, and they were asked a number of times this question.
And the shots were all with the same gun?
Yes, according to a 22.
How is this to be reconciled with the videotapes?
Well, the videotape, if anything, it shows Felipe Gonzalez immediately getting out as if he knows what's just happened. He's the first one out of the car. He bolts. You see the driver stand there and then finally he leaves. You see Angel Rodriguez stand there, and then he leaves. Philippe is immediately out of there.
What about the
If you believe the identifications of who's who in that videotape.
So when did the other 2 shots get done, and by whom?
There's no real evidence of that. I mean, it's difficult to say. If you look, it's
Any evidence that those shots could have been done by somebody on the right side of the victim?
you mean like the passenger front?
No, I mean, was there any testimony about angles and so forth, about?
There was only testimony about angles into the head from the medical examiner. And she was asked, can you tell us what the sequence was? Was the right shot fired first, or was the left shots fired? And she said that she couldn't give an opinion on that in terms of what she looked at.
But they were, both the right temple shot and at least one of the shots to the back of the head were both fatal.
Right temple fatal, one of the 2 to the back left fatal, the other maybe not. One right on top of the other. That's why she concluded the gun couldn't have moved. It must have been bang, bang. It wasn't a contact wound. She said it was, or the ballistics people said about 12 to 15 inches, a close range shot. So in other words, the defendant couldn't reach around like this. That's why I liken it to Zanetti. It would have been kind of physically impossible to reach around and shoot like that. And they don't really, the Commonwealth doesn't really dispute that if the shot is fired in the car, a single shot, then the defendant couldn't have been the one to do it, based upon the evidence.
All right, thank you.
And then, just in closing, in terms of 33E, obviously, where you have cooperating witnesses and you have this type of quality of evidence, it's a candidate for 33E. I do point out that there was a failure to charge in accordance with Chiampa. I'm not going to go into it at length in terms of considering the testimony of these cooperating witnesses carefully. She didn't mention that the charges, the null process had happened. She didn't mention that the fact that they're cooperators, that the Commonwealth vouches for their truth. You also saw in there that there was jury tampering found by the victim's mother and an aunt. Admittedly, the defendant didn't request a mistrial, but the tampering was extreme. It was like spitting at the jurors in their direction in a garage, saying things that prompted one juror to say, Jesus, they could track any of our plates.
All right, well, thank you. Your
Thank you very
time
much.
is up. Ms. Montori.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the Court, I'm Jane Montori, representing the Commonwealth in this case, and I was the second chair at trial. In the light most favorable to the Commonwealth, the testimony of the cooperating witnesses was corroborated by several other pieces of evidence, one being cell phone records, but the most important evidence was the videotape evidence, which the Commonwealth has included in its appendix for the court. And the most important DVD, well, there are 2. One was Exhibit 9A at trial, which is in the Commonwealth's appendix at page 74. The other was Exhibit 8 at trial, which was the surveillance video from Sam's Food, and that's at page 73 of the Commonwealth's appendix. The testimony in this case did come from 2 cooperating witnesses, Luis Soto and Felipe Gonzalez. Their cooperation agreements and the null process that were entered on the murder charges in their cases were admitted as exhibits at trial during their cross-examinations, so they were available to the jury.
Unredacted, I understand.
Unredacted.
And
And every time there was reference to the cooperation agreements during their cross-examination, during the cross-examination of each witness, the judge instructed that that only the jury determines whether they're telling the truth. So the jury was well aware that these two witnesses were
Was Angel ever
cooperating.
prosecuted?
Angel eventually pled guilty, Your Honor, to, I believe it's the intimidation of a witness statute. He was sentenced to state prison.
Was there any evidence that the defendant knew the victim?
Yes, yes, Your Honor. That night started out with Soto and Felipe and Angel in Soto's Nissan Altima. They went to a bar in Holyoke, Gibberito's. During the time that they were there, Angel and Soto made a call to the defendant because they wanted to buy cocaine, and the defendant sold cocaine. And the cell phone records from Angel Gonzalez's cell phone show about 4 calls that occurred from a little before midnight to about 12:25. So they went and they went to this other club, Mambo Club, where the defendant sold them cocaine. They go back to Gibberito's. Angel's mother calls and says the victim is at the hospital and needs a ride. So the 3, Felipe, Soto, and Angel, go to the hospital to pick him up. And they're captured on the Holyoke Hospital videotape, which came into evidence as well, but which I didn't include for the court. But what I did include for the court were the still photographs that were taken at the Holyoke Hospital of Soto, Felipe, and Angel to show what they were wearing, because that becomes important, especially for the Sam's Food video later on. They go back to Gibberito's. Someone comes in and gives the victim a look, and the victim says, we have to go. There was testimony that the victim, that all 3, Soto, Felipe, and Angel, knew the victim. I believe Soto said they had done drugs together in the past. So there was this drug link.
They knew each other. And there was also this, wasn't there testimony that the week before the murder, Angel had taken jewelry from the victim in connection with a drug deal shortage?
It was either Angel or his brother.
So they had this quarrel
Right.
a week before. So there's no question that the 4 of them knew each other. My question had to do with, did the defendant know the victim?
Yes, and when they leave Gibberito's, they decide they want to get a nightcap of cocaine. So Angel calls the defendant again, and during one of those phone calls, the victim speaks to the defendant. So they were at least
How do we know that?
familiar. Soto testified to that, and I believe Felipe did as well. And again, the cell phone records show 3 cell phone calls between Angel and the defendant at about the time they would be traveling back over to the
Any
Mambo
evidence of
Club.
any connection between the defendant and the victim other than he got on the phone the phone call that Angel had made?
No, there's no evidence.
So there's no evidence of the motive he would have had to do this?
No. I mean, not that, it was clear, it was probably drugs, but there was really no clear evidence of that.
And there was no evidence, I gather, of any conversation that preceded the shooting.
There was no everybody was consistent, or Felipe and Soto were consistent, that there were no words exchanged in the car before the shots were fired.
So what was the, am I just completely off the wall about there being something in your brief about expert testimony about how 2 shots fired almost simultaneously?
Well, I think that's a reasonable inference from the evidence, because everybody testified that it was bitterly cold that night. This was a small car. The jury took a view and saw the size of the car.
But is that in your brief? Do you make that point in your brief?
that
It's inferable that the shots were fired in rapid succession?
the medical examiner testified that the 2 shots to the left were fired in rapid succession because of their positions on the head.
But do you,
And Soto testified, I'm sorry, Your Honor, Soto testified that when he heard the shot, what he thought was a shot, his ears were ringing, and the medical examiner was asked, under these circumstances, would that cause the ears to ring? And she said yes. So it was
Well, you mean ring to the point that they couldn't hear a second shot?
correct.
That's what the ME testified to?
Correct. Because it's a small, closed space, and the ballistics expert, Trooper Shrine, testified,
did she actually testify that ringing to the, just what Justice Fina just said? Ringing to the effect that you couldn't hear something else?
Well, no, but I think it's a reasonable inference.
Right, I didn't
from
know
the
whether there'd been
evidence.
any
No, she
explicit
didn't. But she did say that it would cause your ears to ring.
What do you make of the Saint Amand testimony about, I mean, how is it possible for there to be somebody getting into the back seat and then somebody driving, and then the car driving off?
It's the Commonwealth's position that there was only one person in the car, and you'll
And she just got it wrong? When
She just got it wrong. And
She too got it wrong.
She got it wrong as to,
Where
he
he
got
got in.
into the driver's side, he got into the driver's seat. She said he got into the
Back seat.
back seat of
On
the
the
driver's
driver's side.
side.
And,
But-
and
but
wearing
the-
a hoodie, though, when that wasn't what
He was wearing a hat. Someone testified that he was wearing a hat.
Skull cap.
And you'll see from the video that there's blowing snow, especially on Essex Street and at Sam's.
Well, how do you explain what was it, the right rear door closing?
Yeah.
Without any apparent person nearby?
He went around a corner
To the right?
to the, gotta think about this. Yes, he did go to the right.
But
I
why is,
believe.
but what Mr. Harwitz said is that you see on the video that the door is open, the car is driving away with the door open?
It could be. But getting back to the video, I would suggest that the court, when you view the video, to focus on each person in the car individually. Because what you see, and this is the Essex Street video in Exhibit 9A, at 2:02:20, you see the back passenger side fly open almost before the car has stopped. And that's where Felipe Gonzalez is sitting. And he jumps out and he runs up to the corner of High Street and Essex Street. The second person to get out of the car is his brother, about a second later, who's sitting in the front passenger seat, and that's Angel. And again, the hospital photographs are important because you see he's in a light gray sweatshirt, and you can see that fairly. The video isn't great, and even the FBI tried to enhance it, and I don't think it's any better than the original.
Were any of the guns recovered?
No,
And
there was only one gun.
with the same type, with the same gun fired the bullet that entered the right temple as entered the left rear lower
Yes.
skull?
Yes. So they hear this, what they think is one shot, which is actually, in the Commonwealth's theory, 2 shots in rapid succession in a very small, closed car.
Was there any evidence that that any of the shots was fired outside the car? Was there any blood outside? Well, I suppose
Yeah,
there
actually,
was.
there was blood in the street.
Yeah. Was there anything that suggested that perhaps the right temple shot had been fired outside the car?
The defendant was outside the car when he fired that right temple shot, and you'll see it.
And is there any physical evidence that to corroborate that?
You see,
You
you
see
see,
him-
you see somebody
he's-
shooting from the right?
Well, you see someone leaning into the back passenger seat. If you, the defendant was,
After the right passenger has left, this is after Felipe has...
everybody's left.
And so then the videotape shows somebody coming to the right?
If you look at the video, the defendant is in the rear driver's seat. So first Felipe gets out, then Angel gets out, then Luis Soto, the driver, gets out. The last one out of the car is the defendant. And he walks around the back of the car and goes to the rear passenger's door and fires the last shot into
Can
the
you
car.
see it being fired?
You don't see
A flash?
a muzzle flash
So how do you know that it's happening? You're deducing that from the fact that there was
from the fact that there are two shots on the left and one on the right, and he's now on the right side of the victim.
Was there any ballistics evidence inside the car as to where gunpowder might have
No,
been
there,
deposited on the upholstery?
there was no ballistics evidence in the car. There was a discharged casing found in about the place. It was found 2 days later. It had been run over, but in about the place where the defendant was standing. when he-
Outside the car?
Outside the car.
There's no residue on him.
There is no residue on him.
Was there residue on anyone?
I'm not sure anybody else was tested because
When were they arrested as compared to this event?
the Gonzalez brothers and Soto were arrested the next morning. The defendant was arrested at about 8:30 that
Next night?
next night. He was the last to be arrested. He gave a statement to the police, and he said never had seen, didn't know the victim. Thought maybe he had seen him a couple of days before selling some clothing out of a car. He had not been on Newton Street or Essex Street the night before. Yet there was a crusty substance on one of his boots, and the single source of the DNA in that crusty substance was from the victim. He also had, there was a mixture of DNA on the outside of one of his coat pockets. The major profile of that DNA was the victim's, and the minor profile was the defendant's.
That was a left-hand coat pocket? All right.
I'm sorry, Your Honor, I don't remember.
Okay.
So I think it's very important to realize, and it was for the jury, the testimony of Soto and Felipe was corroborated by these videotapes. And to getting back to Your Honor's question about Barbara St. Amand, her testimony suggesting that there were two people in the car when the body was dumped on Newton Street. The Sam's Food video shows, and there are 4 different cameras on the DVD that the Commonwealth has provided. The first camera is the front door, and that shows, and if you start it at about,
Video was this?
it's exhibit number 8, Commonwealth's Appendix 73,
Exhibit 8?
and if you start it
Sam's
at about
Number
2
8?
Yes. If you started at about 2:06 a.m., because it runs from like 1:30 to 3:30 or something. But right around 2:06 on the video time, and there was a stipulation that there was about a 2.5-minute discrepancy between the city's videos times and the Sam's Food video times. But you'll see, Soto arrives first, and then Felipe and Angel. They're all there. And then the car drives up. And it's significant that you see Angel on his cell phone. And his cell phone records show that the defendant called him at about 2:04 So obviously, that's how the car got back to Sam's Food, or that's what the reasonable inference is. And so those three are at Sam's Food, and the defendant is leaving the victim's body on Newton Street and then completing the circle and coming back to Sam's Food.
So the inference being that Angel was at Sam's Food first, and he placed a cell phone call to the defendant.
The defendant actually called him.
Oh, okay. But they made contact, and that's how they knew where to
Leave the car, yes.
reconnoiter.
And when was the call made?
204?
2:04?
06.
Well, the video is at 2:06.
But that's because the video is 2.5 minutes fast.
It's also 2:06.
Right.
So sort of simultaneously with them arriving at Sam's, Angel's on the phone with
Yes.
the defendant?
Yeah, and you can see it in the video. He's the one in the light gray sweatshirt, and he's got his cell phone.
Angel's the one who's had cell phone contact to buy drugs from the defendant?
Yes. Yes. 2:04:07 is when the connection is made between the defendant and Angel's cell phone.
Can we turn to the Champa instructions that really weren't really fully given? Wouldn't you acknowledge that?
Well, they weren't given in the form of Champa, but the substance certainly
Well,
was
really?
given.
You think everything that we've said should be said was said?
Yes. Again, it wasn't in the exact words, but the substance was there. The jury was told to be skeptical of their testimony.
Well, she never cautioned the jury in her final charge that the government doesn't know whether a witness is telling the truth.
Well, she had basically told them that twice during their testimony when the cooperation agreements were entered into evidence. And
She didn't tell them what the particular incentives were that they had gotten
those were before them in the exhibits.
in the cooperation agreement.
Yes.
And had they been highlighted through cross-examination?
Through cross-examination and the closing argument. I mean, the crux of the closing argument were, you can't believe a word these people are saying, because if they don't testify in conformity with what the Commonwealth wants, they're going to be charged with first-degree murder again. And she did, I would suggest, tell them that any promise to tell the truth was irrelevant, and it was the jury and not anyone else, basically, who determines who's telling the truth. And I would just like to apologize for some mathematical errors on page 40 of my brief. It's the Rule 36. First of all, the jury was sworn on December 16th, and there's a typo in my brief saying the 18th. And
Can you send us a letter?
sure, I think that would be easier.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll take our morning recess.